All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsor for the month of ER and Anonymous sponsorship. With Akar Satov to Hashem for all the blessings He has bestowed upon us, for Afushim, for Devorah Leah, Bas Chai Rivka. May we all be zocha to witness the imminent coming of Mashiach. Mihira B'Yameinu. Amen. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Milton, Melanie Gertner, in honor of the wedding of their son Drew Ari to Shira Shemulian in Yerushalayim. We wish the chassan Mazel Brach and Simcha Me'eva Esim Shanim Tovos. Our day of learning sponsor Bradley Bender, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of the 8th yahrzeit of his father Louis Bender, label Ben Ruvain, Zichron Levracha, and we dedicate our learning Le'ili Nishmas, the soldiers who fell in battle yesterday, Amir Galalov, Uri Bar Or, and Ido Apel. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamos have an Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Chole Yisrael. We should be zochet to see the return of our hostages, the Hatzlacha of our soldiers, and Shalom for all of Klal Yisrael. But with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, some really great Gemara. Today's daf is Tzadik Aleph 91. We are picking up Emirat Hashem on Tzadik Amud Beis 90b. Bo'im Minei Rabbi Yonasan Rabbi Simai. It is 2, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16 lines up from the bottom. Asks the Gemara as follows. Bo'im Minei Rabbi Yonasan Rabbi Simai. So Rabbi Yonasan asks the following shayla from Rabbi Simai. Chasma mi bachutz mahu. So we'll say interesting case. So continuing along the sugya of the prohibition of muzzling an animal. So we'll say, so what happens if you go ahead and you muzzle your animal outside of the granary? Meaning what? So imagine, so again, the typical or paradigmatic case would be, I'm going ahead and I'm working with my animal, it's threshing, and as the animal is on the threshing floor, I go ahead and I muzzle it. That's the paradigmatic case. What about the following scenario, where I go ahead and before the animal goes into the threshing floor, I muzzle it. So let's say, so this is actually interesting. In other words, let's just take a typical case. Let's say it's a regular Wednesday, right? The animal is in its pen, and I muzzle the animal. Mutter or aser? Mutter or aser? Mutter, right? There's no prohibition on muzzling your animal. There's a prohibition of muzzling your animal when it threshes. So now the interesting shayla is as follows. What happens if I muzzle the animal before the threshing starts, knowing full well that therefore the animal will enter muzzled into the threshing? Is that the biblical prohibition or not? Fascinating. So the Gemara says as follows. So now, shar bedisha amrachmana vaha lav bedishahu. So on one hand we could say, look, the pasuk is lo sachsam shar bedisho, that you can't go ahead and muzzle an ox while it's threshing. So during the act of threshing itself is when, or I should say immediately prior to the act of threshing on the threshing floor is when you're not allowed to muzzle the animal. But beforehand, right, if you muzzle the animal outside, right, before the animal enters into the threshing floor, I muzzle it, so it walks in muzzled, maybe that shouldn't be a problem. Odoma, lo sidosh bechasima amrachmana. Or maybe not. Maybe the Torah says your animal is not allowed to thresh in a muzzled state. It doesn't matter when you muzzle the animal, whether you muzzle the animal, on the threshing floor before it entered in, on a week ahead of time. You can't thresh with a muzzled animal. So once I see, you hear the shayla. Is it a halacha, is it a din, that when the animal is threshing, you can't actively muzzle it? Or no, you can't thresh with a muzzled animal. What's the nafkamina's practical difference? If you muzzled the animal before the act of threshing began. So here we go. So Amalei, well, it's actually really interesting. So there's this question. So Rabbi Yonasan asked this question to Rabbi Simai. So Rabbi Simai said back to Rabbi Yonasan, I can answer this question based on your family's practices. And I was saying quite beautifully, Rabbi Yonasan was a Kohen. So Rabbi Simai says, I can respond to this based on Kohanic practices. Also, this is very interesting. Listen to this. Yain v'shecher al teisht, ata uvanecha itcha bevoachem. So also, so the pasuk says, this is a command ultimately again to Aaron and his sons, right? Wine and intoxicating beverage you shall not drink, you and your sons, when you enter into the Oel Moed. In other words, you can't do the avoda under the influence, right? Can't do the avoda while inebriated. Okay, so now watch this. So on one end you can say, what does this sound like? It sounds like the only time you can't drink is when you're entering into the mikdash. In other words, so you can't go ahead and bring wine or beer with you or intoxicating beverage into the Mishkan and drink up right before you do the avoda. But again, however, ha mishta mal shari. But maybe you'll say, but you could drink before the avoda. In other words, you just can't drink on the job. Can't drink on the job. But if you want to go ahead and pregame it, then fine, no problem. Go ahead as long as you're not drinking on the job itself. Tushimar says that can't be. Why not? Because the Torah says, why can't a Kohen drink? Why can't the Kohen be inebriated ultimately while doing the avoda? Because the avoda requires the ability to distinguish between kodesh and chol, that which is holy, that which is profane. In other words, the avoda requires attentiveness and requires mental sharpness, so you can't drink. So we'll say, therefore again, so therefore we'll say, what does that tell you? That tells you you can't drink in the Mishkan while doing the avoda or before the avoda. So the Gemara says, "Elama hasam b'shas bia lote shechrus." So say what it means is at the time you enter into the mikdash or Mishkan, you can't be under the influence. So the idea over here is, what do you see from here? So whether you're going ahead and drinking on the job or whether you're drinking beforehand, you can't be in a state of inebriation when doing the avoda. Hachanami b'shas disha lo techasima. So to over here, I will say the prohibition is not simply that you can't muzzle the animal while it's actively threshing, but rather what it means is the animal can't be in a muzzled state at the time that you are threshing. So therefore, I will say halacha l'maisa, and this is how the Rambam paskins. Halacha l'maisa. Not only can you not muzzle the animal during the actual act of threshing, but you can't muzzle the animal preceding the act of threshing either. In other words, you can't go ahead and you can't thresh with an animal that is muzzled. That's the idea. Whether you muzzled it right now, or whether you muzzled it, 10 minutes ago before it was even by the threshing floor, you can't thresh with a muzzled animal. Okay, incredible. Weiter, Itmar. An interesting case here, we'll say. Itmar, I'm sorry, Tan Rabbanon. Hachosim esapara. So we'll say if a person goes out and muzzles an animal, va'mezavig b'kilayim pater. Now, this is actually interesting. So, what's happening? If you look at Rashi, almost right across, Rashi says, Hachosim esapara, v'lo ha'avira al hadisha v'chavero dashba. So we'll say it's an interesting question. Watch this. Let's say Ruvain muzzles the animal, but Shimon is the one who actively goes ahead and takes it to thresh. Or for that matter, mezavig es hakilayim. We'll say we know that you're not allowed to plow with two different species of animals connected to the same yoke. That's called kilayim, forbidden mixtures. So let's say a person look at Rashi, mezavig. Rashi says over here, shar v'chamar lekaron ubach. So we'll say, so now let's say Ruvain put two animals under the same yoke, but didn't do anything. Uba achar v'hinhig, and ultimately again, then Shimon came along and led the animals together. So we'll say, so you see what's happening in both of these cases? One person is performing the act of muzzling or performing the act of hitching the animal to the yoke, but a second person is then causing the animal to thresh or pulling the yoke together with the two animals attached to it. So one person is performing, again, the muzzling / yoking. I don't know if yoking is the right verb, but we'll just use it for now, right? Yoking, and then the second person is coming along and taking the animal to thresh or leading it forward. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, Pater ve'ino loke ela dash umanik bilvad. So we'll say, this is intuitive, but it's interesting. So the first person is Pater. Why? Because we'll say the prohibition is not to muzzle the animal. The prohibition is, as we just said before, is to thresh with a muzzled animal. Same idea with kilayim. There is no problem with going ahead and putting two animals of difference under the same yoke. The idea is either leading them together or working with them together. Therefore, in these cases, the first person, Ruvain, is going to be Pater, and the second person, Shimon, is going to be Chayiv. All right, incredible. Itmar, Chasma b'kol v'nhiga b'kol. But it's a very interesting case here. Let's say you muzzled an animal with your voice. Now, what does this mean? This is actually fascinating. There's no muzzle on the animal. Just so the animal is threshing, and every single time the animal is about to eat, I yell at it. I yell at it. There are marriages like this, by the way. Right? I yell at it. I yell at it so that ultimately, again, the animal doesn't eat. The animal doesn't eat. So it's interesting. That's what it means to muzzle with your voice. So again, there's no muzzle on the animal. But every single time I see it bow its head to be able to eat something, I yell and it stops eating. Or, hinhiga bakal, or we'll say again, the kilayim case. I have two animals of two different species, right, yoked together. And now again, I yell at the animals, I scream at it, and the animals move forward. You're going to both say, just to understand, we're going to get more into the prohibition of kilayim. Kilayim, forbidden mixtures. Can't take two species, just like you can't mate them together. You also can't put them under the same yoke together. Being on the same yoke is not the prohibition. Leading, right, moving forward, that's the prohibition. That's the prohibition. So in these cases, again, there's no physical yoke, right? There's no physical muzzle, right? And ultimately, I'm not pushing or pulling them together, but I'm muzzling the animal with my voice. Leading the animals up. What's the halacha? Rabbi Yochanan says yichayiv. Reish Lakish amar pater. So we'll say machlokes. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So we'll say this is a really fascinating machlokes. Here we go. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan amar chayiv. Rabbi Yochanan says that you're chayiv. Why? Akimas piv havya maisa. Rabbi Yochanan says doing something with your mouth is a maisa, is an action. Even though over here all I'm utilizing is speech, it's dibur. And dibur generally is not maisa. In this case, Rabbi Yochanan says dibur is maisa. Dibur is maisa. And I'll say, so which part of speech is the maisa? So that's what it means, akimas piv. Literally, again, like the moving of your lips. The moving of your lips, that's called a maisa. Reish Lakish amar pater. Reish Lakish says, is your pater. Why? Kala lo havi maisa. This is not action. This is speech. This is speech. And speech by definition is not a maisa. So we'll say fundamental machlokes. Se'esi Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. So Rabbi Yochanan raised the kasha to Reish Lakish. Top of Tzadik Aleph 91a. Lo sha'adam rashay lahamir. So we'll say very interesting halacha over here. Timura. What's the halacha of timura? If you have a certain animal designated as a sacrificial animal, you can't exchange it for another, even if the second one is better. And if you do so, there's a penalty. Vayahu usmura so kodesh. Both animals become consecrated. So now watch this. Now obviously a person is not permitted to go ahead and make an exchange, a timura. El she'im hemir mumar. But if you did make the exchange, it works. And ultimately, again, you get malchus. Now we'll say, look at Tap Rashi. Lo sha'adam rashay lahamir, reisha demastis and akoma mirin, echad ha'anoshim ve'echad ha'anoshim. So we'll say, remember again, anyone could affect Tmura. A man could affect Tmura, a woman could affect Tmura. Umefarish va'azil da'hai ha'koma mirin, lo sha'adam rashay lahamir, so we'll say, when the Gemara points out over here, when the Mishnah says Hakom Amir and everyone does Tamura, it makes it sound like it's a mitzvah. Right? The Gemara says, no, it's asr. You're not allowed to do Tamura, but if you did it, it's effective. A man did it, a woman did it, it's effective. Now we'll say, and you get malchus for going ahead and doing Tamura, for substituting sacrificial animals. Now we'll say, what's the al-chap over here? Now remember, what does Tamura consist of? What does Tamura consist of? Tamura is dibur. Tamura is speech, right? I have animal A designated as a carbon, and then I say, you know what? B is even nicer, or it's not nicer, whatever it is. I want to use B instead of A. All there is over here is speech. There's no act. I mean, there could be an act, but there doesn't have to be. You could also affect Tamura by speech. So what do you see from here? What do you see from here? That speech is halachically effective. That speech ultimately creates realities. And I will say ultimately again, this would seem to be a proof to Rabbi Yochanan and a kasha on Reish Lakish. Related to which Reish Lakish would say, no. Hamani, whose opinion is this? Hamani, Rabbi Yehudahi, Da'amar lav she'ein bo maisa lokin alav. All right, I'll say a lot of stuff coming our way this morning, right? A lot of information. So the Gemara says, no. Whose opinion is this? This is Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda holds that a lav she'ima maisa, even a prohibition that does not have a physical act associated with it, is still going to be a biblical prohibition, and you can get malchus on it. Rashi says over here, Rabbi Yehuda, he bekama duchti maisina la lo sosira meno ad vanosir meno ad boker ba kasov litin ase achalos. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda is mentioned a number of times with this. Rabbi Yehuda has a unique position that a lav she'ima maisa, if you transgress a prohibition, even if there is no physical act involved in that prohibition, you are still chayiv. So therefore, again, Abba says, so now watch this. What we have over here, therefore, is Rabbi Yochanan holding like Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, if you go ahead and you muzzle an animal with your voice, The animal is about to eat, you yell at it. And every single time you see it bow its head to eat, you yell at that animal, preventing it from eating. That is a prohibition. You're chayiv for chasima, for muzzling the animal, even though it's a lav she'ein bo ma'isa. Okay? So the Gemara says, one second. And the Gemara is suggesting this is Rabbi Yochanan following the view of Rabbi Yehuda. To which the Gemara says, Umi matzis mokmos like Rabbi Yehuda. Really? You're going to set this up like Rabbi Yehuda? Vaha katani reisha. Yet look at the reisha. What was the reisha we just read before? Hakol mamirin. Echad hanoshim ve'echad hanoshim. So I will say, what did we say before? Right in the Mishnah we quoted before. Everyone is able to do Tamura. Everyone is able to do Tamura. Now again, I will say, just to be clear, right, as we said before, you're not allowed to do Tamura. When it says everyone could do Tamura, what does that mean? That everyone could technically transgress Tamura. Men, women, va'avinon ba, hakol la'asuyei mai. And I will say, we said, what does hakol come to include? Right? Like, who is that coming to include? I obviously will say, hakol sounds like a much broader statement than just men and women. Anytime you see hakol is usually coming to include something else which is unique. So who else is hakol coming to include? La'asuye yoresh, very interesting case here, I will say, to include an inheritor. Now look at Rashi, right across in Rashi. Shimhemer bekarban aviv la'achar misas aviv mutter. Now, I watch this. Let's say Yaakov dies. Right, Yaakov dies, and Yaakov leaves behind his son, Ruvain. Now, interestingly enough, Yaakov had also designated an animal as a karban, and yet never had the ability to go ahead and offer it up. So technically, Ruvain could offer up his father's karban. Let's say Ruvain does tumura on his father's karban. Right? So does that work? So now can you do Tamura on a sacrificial animal that you did not designate as a sacrificial animal? So the Gemara says that when it says Hakol Mamirin, everyone could do Tamura. Who does that come to include? That comes to include even a Yoresh. The Gemara says, Udolok Rabbi Huda. And this does not reflect the view of Rabbi Huda. Why? Dik Rabbi Huda ha'amar Yoresh eino mamir. Rabbi Huda holds that an inheritor cannot do Tamura, and Yoresh eino somech. And an inheritor does not do smicha. Does not do smicha. Look at Rashi. Rashi says over here. Rashi says Yoresh eino mamir v'mhemer eino mumar v'tayim afarish b'tamura. So we'll say again. Rashi doesn't get into the reasoning over here, but Rabbi Huda holds that an inheritor doesn't have the ability to do Tamura. Again, I will say the logic being the only person who has the ability to do Tamura is who? Is the individual who vested the animal with initial sacrificial sanctity. So the person who made animal A karban has the quote-unquote ability to exchange it for something else. Again, it's prohibited. When we say ability, it means it works. It's usser, but it works. So I will say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that this can't be Rabbi Yehuda. We were trying to say before that the whole concept of Tamura, right, and this whole idea that ultimately, again, words could affect realities, Rabbi Yehuda holds a lav she'ein bo ma'isa, ultimately, again, is going to be prohibited. Yet it can't be Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda is on record as saying that a Yoresh cannot go ahead, an inheritor cannot do Tamura. And now we just said that the Hakol Mamirin comes to include a Yoresh. So it can't be Rabbi Yehuda, to which the Gemara says, no. Ultimately, the Tana over here will say holds like Rabbi Yehuda in one case, doesn't hold like him in another case. Meaning what? He holds like Rabbi Yehuda that a lav she'ein b'maisa is going to be asar, but ultimately, again, he doesn't hold like Rabbi Yehuda, and that Rabbi Yehuda holds that a Yoresh, an inheritor, can't do Tamura, whereas the Tana holds that inheritor can do Tamura. Okay, so we'll say. So now, that's the end of that. That's the end of that section. How do we paskin? So we'll say the Rambam paskins that chasma b'kol. If you muzzle the animal with your mouth, you're chayif. That is considered to be an act of muzzling. So we'll say it's actually very interesting. So now we have a case where I'm not actually muzzling the animal, but if every single time I go ahead and the animal's about to eat, I yell at it and prevent it from eating, that is effectively the biblical prohibition of muzzling. Now the truth is, it's not such a chiddush, because reading yesterday's daf, we saw other cases, like for example, I put a thorn in the animal's mouth, right? I put a lion outside the granary, right? So what you see over here is essentially biblical muzzling is any case where I actively do something to prevent the animal from eating, whether that's a physical muzzle or any other intervening action. I am chayiv for the lav of chasima. So if you're standing there yelling at the animal not to eat every single time, that is the prohibition of muzzling. I will say, it's also interesting, right? Rabbi Yochanan clearly holds akimas piv havyamaisa, that literally the moving of your lips is not just voice, the moving of your lips is a maisa. So Rabbi say again, ein hochacha gidol mizo. We have again yimei svira. So very often what happens after Lag BaOmer, we kind of move past the morning motif of Sira, because many of us hold to the first half of Sira, but the maisa still the entire period of Sira is marked by a concept of mourning. The death of Rabbi Akiva's students. Why did Rabbi Akiva's students die? The Gemara says, "Nitnei shelo nagu kavod zeh lo zeh." Shabbos say they did not demonstrate proper honor and dignity one to the other. And I will say, now one thing is clear: they weren't just going over to each other, slapping each other, right? Whatever it was, it was a verbal trespass, right? Whatever it was something with their words, something with the way that they were interacting with each other that was just not right. So I will say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that akimas piv havyamaisa. Sira teaches us that akimas, how you talk, what you say, what you do, as much as it's only words, quote unquote, and as much as it's only voice, it's only sound, but lamaisa, again, what you say and how you verbally communicate and how you verbally interact is absolutely a maisa. Again, it's halacha lamaisa in the halacha of chasima. You verbally muzzle your animal, you are chayiv, and it's halacha lamaisa certainly in life. Words absolutely matter. What we say, how we say it has dramatic impacts on ourselves and on the people around us. Incredible Gemara. Let's go back to Turn Abanon. Well, it says some really great cases. Hachosim esapara v'dashba. So we'll say this is really interesting. Let's say I muzzle an animal, right? And I thresh with it. So we'll say, so now not only am I in violation of a biblical prohibition, but I also have to pay. Now this is assuming over here that let's say I'm threshing with a borrowed animal or a rented animal, right? But let's go with a borrowed animal. Right? So I borrow an animal from Ruvain and I thresh with it. And when I thresh with it, I muzzle it. So now the Gemara says there's two prohibitions. Number one, I violated a lav d'oraisa because I muzzled the animal. That's number one. And number two, I also have to pay Reuven. Assuming Reuven is the owner of the animal, I have to pay him. What do I have to pay him? 4 kav for a cow and 3 kav for a donkey. We'll say 4 kav and 3 kav represent the respective amounts that the animal would have normally consumed while threshing. So I have to go ahead and pay that back. I have to pay that to the owner of the animal. Now, this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, now what's the logic? The logic over here is because when the animal was threshing, it would be normal for the animal to eat, right? So that eating represents a certain cost savings that the owner of the animal would have had because he would not have to go ahead and feed his animal. Now that I deprived him of that, I owe him that money. Very interesting. Gemara says, 1 second. This is a great sugya. I will say in general, we have a klal that whenever you're getting malchus, right, whenever you're getting lashes, pretty much any time that you go ahead and violate the biblical prohibition of lav, there's usually going to be lashes. Now the way it works with lashes is there's no double jeopardy, right? You can't get lashes and a death sentence. Or you can't get lashes and have to pay. So if I'm muzzling the animal, that's going to be malchus right then and there. First of all, whoever thought that muzzling was so exciting, right? If somebody would have told you we're going to learn about lo sachsam sharbadish, you'd be like, oh, great. I say it's really riveting stuff. It's incredible. So I would say, so now I don't understand how am I getting lashes from muzzling plus have to pay? What's the pshat with that? To which the Gemara says, Abaye Hamani Rabbi Meir. So I will say, this is really interesting. No. Whose opinion is this? Rabbi Meir. The Amar Loke Mashalim. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion, I will say, that you can get malchus and have a monetary payment. That you could be liable to both. Now, where do we see this? So the Gemara says, I will say, this is very interesting. So this is Rabbi Meir who says Loke u'mishalim. Okay, Rashi points out there it's Rabbi Meir and Maseches Makis. Okay, fine. So the Gemara says as follows: Rava says Esnan Aser Torah. So we'll say now watch this. Really interesting case. Esnan zona. What's the halacha? If a man goes to a zona, man goes to a prostitute, he goes in and he pays her, and instead of paying her with money, he gives her a sheep. So now the zona decides, you know what? I want to offer up this sheep as a carbon. doesn't work. Can't do that. It doesn't need to be explained. It's quite understandable, right? Can't use the payment for immoral services as a karban. That's called esnan zona. Now listen to this, Rabbi. Esnan asra Torah afilu ba'al imo. All right, so we'll say, now watch this. Let's say a man went to his mother who's a zona. He had relations with his mother. Now we'll say, now this is interesting, because remember, so now obviously relations with his mother is misa, right? Is incest, is punishable by death. So what happens if he ends up paying his mother the esnan, the sheep? Let's say he gives her a sheep. So can she offer that up as a karban? So look at Rashi. This is really quite interesting. Rava Amar Esnan Asra Torah Filu Balimo V'Nasan La Be'esnanan Esnan Huva Asra Karban. So I'll say, so now watch this. So man has relations with his mother who's a zona. So in other words, he goes to her as a zona. He then goes ahead and pays her, gives her a sheep. So now the Gemara says that sheep that he gave her has the status of Esnan Zona, has the status of a harlot's payment. Now, you'll see the chiddush of that in just a moment. So the Gemara says, the Esnan Stamaksiv, Loshna Imo, Veloshna Pnuya. Now, it doesn't matter if the harlot is his mother or the harlot is a regular single woman. The Afagav di Itavala Bedina Kaman, Taimli Esnani, Lo Michayvinole. Now imagine the following situation. Imagine man had relations with his mother who's a zona. She says, okay, where's the payment? He says, come on, mom. Right, it's family, right? So then what happens? She takes him to Beis Din. Right? So I'll say, can you imagine this? You're like, I'm taking off today, right? I'm sorry, I can't do this, right? She takes him to Beis Din. So we'll say, now again, just analyze, I know it sounds strange, it is strange, but just analyze it from does she have a legal claim against her son for payment? Now again, I just want to point out, take a typical case, right? Where like a man goes to a zona, not related to him, right? Man goes to a zona, doesn't pay her. Does she have an enforceable claim? Everyone's nervous to answer this, right? Yes, she has an enforceable claim. In other words, she provided a service. He agreed to pay for the service. Now he's not paying, right? It's going to be a very awkward din Torah for this guy, right? But Lamaisa, she has an enforceable claim. Rabbi said, here's what's interesting. If it's his mother, the zona is his mother, she doesn't have an enforceable claim. It's amazing how everyone woke up, right? Now again, right? So I say, so now again, if it's his mother, she doesn't have an enforceable claim. Now why doesn't she have an enforceable claim? Why not? She doesn't have an enforceable claim because there's no monetary case over here. Why? Because since this is a capital case, because he had relations with his mother, therefore, technically speaking, there is no enforceable monetary claim. Now watch this. Now finish up in Rashi. This is really interesting. If she were to take him to Beis Din and say, hey, give me my payment, because we'll say there's no enforceable payment over here, Rashi says, because remember again, he's subject to a death penalty. Now we'll say, here's what's fascinating. Even though there is no enforceable monetary claim, okay? So watch this. So therefore, if mother were to take son to Beis Din, she couldn't extract money. If he does pay her, that sheep that he pays her with has the status of Esnan Zona, has the status of a harlot's payment. Okay? Now understand the impact of it. Alma, afilu b'makom yisrael. I said, okay, let me just explain to you the chiddush in that. I would have thought that because there is no enforceable monetary claim here, therefore what? Therefore the payment doesn't take on the halachic status of harlot's payment. Now, because it doesn't take on the status of harlot's payment, therefore what? If the mother wants to use it for a karban, she should be able to do it. The chiddush over here is, even though there is no enforceable monetary claim, the payment still takes on the status of esnan zona, and she can't use it as a karban. Interesting. Now, what does that show you? Look at Rashi. Alma, afil b'makom misa nami ramu tashlumin alei, ela she'en koach la'ansho b'shtayim, ava yidei shamayim lo yatsa ad she'yishalim. So I say this is interesting. What do you see from here? That when you incur a death penalty, or lashes for that matter, there is no enforceable monetary claim. But if you want to do the right thing, it's still important to pay. So I don't know, it's interesting. I don't know if this is Rashi actually saying that if a man had relations with his mother who's the zona, as much as halacha l'maisa, there is no enforceable monetary claim, he should still pay. Like, in other words, that technically speaking, there's this hovering, monetary obligation that is unenforceable, but still there. So the Gemara says, Lo yatsa achi shalim di lo ramat tashlumin alei ki yav v'nehile mehave esnan matana ba'alma hu di yoivla. So we'll say, listen to this, because if there was no obligation to pay, even though it's not enforceable, therefore when son gives his mother the sheep, that sheep shouldn't have the status of an esnan. What should that sheep be? What should it be? A gift. Matana. The fact that it's still treated as an esnan indicates to us that he owes her that money, even though it's not an enforceable claim. So everyone will say, bringing this full circle, the Gabi Chosi Nami, reading Rashi, Gabi Tashlumin Rami Ale, Ela She'in Koach Bebezdin La'ansho Shtayim, the Cheva de Ramu Tashlumin Ale, Lo Yatzadei Chabaso Ad Shi Yishalim. So everyone will say, this is incredible. So now let's circle all the way back. We got a little bit sidetracked over here. So everyone will say, what did the Gemara say? I borrow an ox from Ruvain, and I go out and I muzzle it, and I thresh with it muzzled. So the Gemara says there's dual liability. Number one, I violated a lav d'oraisa and I get malchus for violating the lav. Number two, I owe him 3 kav, or whatever it was, 4 kav. 4 kav, which represents the amount that the animal would have consumed. You can't get malchus and have to pay. You're right. The monetary part is unenforceable in a court of law, but it's still obligatory. In other words, what we call, let's say, sidei shemayim. If you want to do what's right, in other words, if you ask a shayla, what should I do in this case? Get your malchus, okay, take it like a man, get your malchus, and pay. Got it, it's not enforceable in Beis Din, but sometimes there's an obligation to do the right thing, even if it's not technically speaking legally enforceable. Fascinating, riveting, incredible. Rapapa says, Mishas Meshicha, Echayleim Zonosah, Umilka Loloki Achas Chasima. So Papa says, you guys are getting it all wrong. Rabbi said the concept of Kilei B'Drabamine, right, of getting the more severe punishment and being exempted from monetary liabilities only when there is simultaneity. But it is not ultimately, again, in a case where halacha l'maisa, the two obligations are incurred separately. So remember again, the person is obligated in mizonos from the moment that he took possession of the animal. But yet, interestingly enough, malchus doesn't come until the actual act of muzzling. Because there's no simultaneity, therefore you are chayiv for both. Incredible. Amar Papa, Hani mili ba'o mine debeira Papa bar Abba, upashti leila asura liisura chad kilchasa v'chad lav kilchasa. So we'll say, okay, so fine. So we finished up that case, and I will say, by the way, that is the halacha l'maisa, right? If a person goes ahead and muzzles with a borrowed animal, so number one, there's malchus for the act of muzzling. Number two, there is some monetary obligation because you deprived the borrowed animal or the owner of the borrowed animal from having his animal eat, which represents a loss, a financial loss. Again, that financial liability is not enforceable in a court of law, but Allah l'maisa, and nevertheless it really is incumbent upon the borrower to pay it. Good. Next. So I'll say this interesting introduction. The following questions were asked of Debei Rapapa bar Abba, Nishiva Rapapa, right? And ultimately, again, they were answered both li'isura. He answered them both that they're asr. But one was in accordance with halacha, and one was not in accordance with halacha. Now I will say what that means is, one was asr by the letter of the law, and the other was asr just by what we'll call the spirit of the law. Now watch this. Listen to this. This is actually a really interesting case. A lot of interesting stuff today. Mo lalush esa'isa b'chalaf. Rabbi say, can you make dairy bread? Are you allowed to make dairy bread? Right? Can you knead bread with milk? Upashtile li'isura kilchasa. Rabbi say the halacha is, it is usher to make dairy bread. This is a very important halacha. By the way, it's not just dairy bread. You can't make dairy bread. You can't make fleishik bread, right? Milchik bread. Bread has to always be parif. The sanya. Right? The imlash kalapas kula sura. You cannot knead bread. with milk, and if you did so, ultimately, again, it is aser. Why? Mipnei hergal avera. Now, we'll say it's a very simple idea. Bread, ultimately, again, is a staple, right? It's a staple item. Therefore, again, bread is eaten with all kinds of meals. The concern is, if you make your loaf of bread, milchiks or fleishiks, you may come to inadvertently consume it with the other type of food. So therefore, Chazal said, no, bread can't have denominational bread. Can't be milchiks, fleishiks, can only be parable. Say, by the way, this is a very important halacha, because if a person bakes challah on Shabbos, on Shabbos, Erev Shabbos, and a person is making their Shabbos food at the same time. Let's say, again, I'm making chicken, I'm making meat, uncovered in the same oven as challah, that is aser. You're not allowed to do that. Challah has to be part of. I am eating fleishiks the whole Shabbos. That's fine. That's good for you. But l'maisa, at the end of the day, challah has to be what we'll call non-denominational from a kashrus perspective. It has to be part of. There are exceptions to this rule. Exceptions to this rule is if you make bread in a different form, in a different shape, or similar. For example, potato bread. Potato bread is often known to be milchiks. So if there are certain types of bread that you know are always milchiks, then again, that's fine. But in general, a loaf of bread, a challah that you make, has to be part of a very important halacha. So the Gemara says, similarly, in touch Singing, I will say, if you greased the oven with schmaltz, with fat, so again, and then you baked challah in it, the challah is aser. The challah is aser, and challah, the bread is aser, until you burn out the oven. You'd have to kasher the oven, and ultimately, again, go ahead and there was a big thing. I remember this is a long time ago. They used to have, I forgot the brand, they used to have these hot dog rolls that were potato rolls, and they were certified kosher dairy. They're certified kosher dairy. And it was a particular kashrus agency, I think, had to change it. I think either had to withdraw the hashkach or they had to reformulate it, because mamish, it was like a lifnei iver thing, right? Can you imagine having milchik hot dog rolls? They were good? So probably they were good, but aser. Good, but aser. That could be the tagline on the package, right? So the Gemara goes right there. So that halacha, both say, ultimately again is aser, but it's aser in conformance with halacha. That's kidin. V'tanya v'idach, another brisa. Or another ruling. V'idach b'minei. Another ruling was asked of them. Here we go. Ma'ala hachnis min b'she'eno min la'ladir. So this is a very interesting case. So now we're transitioning to kilayim for just a moment. So kilayim means you can't create forbidden mixtures around. So remember again, the biblical prohibition of kilayim is you can't mate animals of two different species. Okay? Now, am I allowed to put two different species of animals in the same barn, deer or pen, in the same pen together, knowing that animals are animals, right? So, Bapashos, if they're in the same pen together, something's going to happen. And ultimately, again, they paskin that it was aser to put different species of animals in the same pen. But really, again, me'ikar adin, this probably isn't aser, but nevertheless, they ruled that it was aser. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel, so we'll say in general, when it comes to, if a person is testifying about adultery, about a couple that committed adultery. So the halacha is, we'll see this more in Maseches Makos, but the halacha is, you don't have to see the actual act of bia, the actual act of intercourse, in order to testify that people committed adultery. Rather it's enough to see circumstantial evidence of people behaving in the way in which intimacy occurred. So Rashi points out over here, if you see them in the same bed, right? So again, you didn't see an act of relations. You don't have to see an act of relations in order to understand what it is that's occurring over here. So the Gemara says, now again, that's not our topic, but kilayim achiyachnis kimicha b'shvafaris. But I will say, listen to this. With kilayim, this is actually interesting. With forbidden mixtures, ultimately, again, the prohibition of bringing together different species of animals is not violated until there's an actual act of relations between the animals. right? Kimilcham b'shalharis means like a tube and an applicator. It's a euphemism. It's a euphemism for intercourse, right? So the idea over here is you don't violate, the biblical prohibition for kilayim is literally only when there's an actual act of intercourse, which is very important. Because what does that tell you? What that tells you is putting animals of different species in the same pen is not the biblical prohibition. That's why, again, the Beira Papa is saying over here, I know that it's not technically usher, but I'm paskening that it's usher. I'm paskening that it's usher. Okay? So the Gemara says, Masiv Rav Achtabai. So Rav Achtabai says, now I want to point out over here something interesting. If you look at Rashi, B'kilayim, Eino chayv at sheyachnis biyado evar hazachar b'nekeva kimakacha b'shvafares. So this is interesting. Apparently, on a biblical level, one only transgresses the prohibition of intermingling species when the person actually facilitates the act of intercourse between the animals. I guess what this is I guess with the animals of different species, they don't just automatically mate with each other, but rather it has to be facilitated. So we're talking about over here that the biblical prohibition of interbreeding would be literally, again, taking the male animal and actually inserting it into the female animal of the different species. That's the biblical prohibition of intermingling species, actual facilitation of the act of intercourse between two animals of different species. So therefore, again, technically speaking, putting them in the same pen would not be the biblical prohibition, but nevertheless, the Beira Papa Paskin, Aser. So the Gemara says, Maser Vachtabai Bar Ami, Ilu Nemar Be'ahem Techalo Sarbia. If the pasuk would have just said, you can't cause your animal to mate, Hayisi Omer, I would have said, Lo Yochaz Adam HaBehema B'shar Sha'ola Aleha Zachar. So I would say, I would have thought like this. Maybe even in a regular, if Polar would have just said, you can't mate your animals, I would have thought that maybe you can't hold the female in place when the male has relations with her. Now, what would be wrong with that? If we're talking about animals of the same species, maybe it's just not appropriate, just like from just like a morality perspective, right? To be involved in animal mating. In other words, like let the animals do their own thing, right? And you don't get involved in that, could cause impure thoughts, which we'll discuss, right? But Lamaisa, maybe I should stay away from that. Talmud Lomar Kilayim. Therefore, the Torah says, no. You can't mate your animals in a Kilayim perspective. However, Lav Mechlad the Kilayim Achiz and Namilo. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That by Kilayim, you can't be involved in the mating. And we'll say, even if you're not actually facilitating the act of relation, or you're not placing the male into the female, but rather you're just holding the female in place, you can't do that either. So the Gemara says, no, Gemara says, sorry, my love. My what's achiza? Hachnasa. Now we'll say back, it's actually really interesting. By kilayim, I will say, the prohibition of mating different species together is literally inserting the male into the female. That is the prohibition of kilayim. The Gemara says, Va'amai karli achiza. So why does it call it holding the animal down? If at the end of the day it's actually inserting the male into the female, lishna ma'alya, it's just a nicer way to say it. Just a nice way to say it. I will say, what comes out of it, really a lot of interesting facts today, which is, so here you see the prohibition of kilayim is literally inserting the male of one species into the female of another species. That is the biblical prohibition. Amar Rav Yehuda, min b'mina motor lahachnis kimekachal b'shvaf eres. So Rabbi Yehuda says, however, with animals of the same species, you are allowed. So let's say again, I have an ox and a cow, right? I am actually allowed to facilitate the act of relations by helping to insert the male into the female. The Gemara says, "Va'afilu mishum pritzusa leka." Now let's say, now you might have thought like this: to be so actively involved in the act of animal relations, I don't know, maybe just cause a person to think impure thoughts, or maybe just a person, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. So the Gemara says, no, there's not even an issue of immorality. Prisos, why not? My taima ba'aviditatari. Because they will say, Bepashtos, this is not like a recreational activity, right? Bepashtos, what this is over here is, I'm a farmer, right? Or I'm a shepherd, whatever the right term over here is, and I'm doing this to mate my animals in order to grow my flock. So this is my work. Because it's my work, ultimately, again, there's no pritzus, right? There's no immorality, there's no impure thoughts. Rashi says over here, if you look at the last Rashi, the Gemara says, we're not worried that you're going to come to impure thoughts. So I'll say, this is interesting. In general, the Gemara says, you shouldn't watch animals when they mate. Shouldn't watch animals when they mate. Why not? So we'll say the Gemara says because it could cause impure thoughts. Why are we concerned about this over here? The hasem kisheno shalo sheno tzarich l'sayeh aval hay ba'avidite tarid v'lo maharher. So we'll say that's in general. That's in general, right? The animals are not yours, not your responsibilities. You shouldn't watch animals mate because it could go ahead and cause impure thoughts. But over here, this is my work, right? I'm mating the animals because these are my animals. This is my work. Because it's my work, I'm not going to come to impure thoughts. Now let's say, by the way, I just want to point out something absolutely amazing. What a line over here. The Gemara says, Mishum pritzusa leka, my time ba'avidit. I will say, what is the best way to keep my mind off impure thoughts? What is the best way in general to keep myself on the path of morality and out of the way of immoral behavior? The best way? Ba'avidit. Be busy. Be busy. When a person is involved in avodah, and by the way, I will say, avodah doesn't even have to mean just avodas Hashem, right? Avodah means, we know this in life. I will say, when I am having a good and busy day, and I'm engaged, and I'm accomplishing, I feel great, and we know it's incredible. You know what's incredible? There is an inverse relationship between desire to sin and productivity of my day. The more productive and focused I am, and the more I am accomplishing things, it's incredible. The less the Yetzer Hara is pulling me towards all kinds of stuff. Yet conversely, when I'm not busy, or just when I'm not productive, then suddenly the push and pull to sin is so much more acute. The Gemara says, Mishum pritzus aleka, when is there no pritzus? When is there a diminished desire to sin? When I'm actively involved in productive living. Stack your day productively. Fill your time productively. And we see, amazingly enough, the desire for pritzos, the desire for sin, the desire for immorality, the desire for just things that are not going to get me anywhere is diminished dramatically. Such an incredible Gemara. So, Masiv Ravach Tawai, Amis Ravach Tawai, Ami raised the Kasha, Ami Bezer Bosai, Ilu Nemra Behem Tchalos Arbiyah. Had the pasuk said, you can't mate your animal. I would have said, a person can't even go ahead and keep the female in place, right? For the male to have relations with her. Talmud Lomar Kilai. Therefore, the pasuk says, no. When it comes ultimately again to mating regular animals, the owner could even be actively involved in facilitation of that act. It's only in Kilayim where it's around. Kilayim hu da'aser hamin b'mino shari. But again, maybe even with animals of the same species, so ultimately again you could hold the female in place so that the male could have relations with her, but maybe you're not allowed to actively insert the male into the female, to which the Gemara says, no, my achiza, what's achiza? Hachnosa. It means actually, again, putting the male into the female. Va'amai karli achiza. So why does it call it achiza holding? Lishna ma'alya, just a nicer lashon. Just a nicer lashon. So what's the Gemara goes weiter. Amar Ravashi, Hamilsa boy minay debate Rav Nechemia Reish Kalusa. But the following question was asked: Ma'al lahachnis min b'mino v'she'eno mino l'dir. So we'll say. So let's stop here for just a second. So first of all, what's the halacha in the previous case? So we'll say that's why again the Beirav Papa said that halacha l'maisa you can't put. Actually, the Rambam Paskins. The Rambam actually says, so the Beirav Papa wanted to say that you can't put different species of animals in the same pen. Now he said, I'm saying it's asr, but that's not asr mitzada halacha. Right? We'll say the halacha is, what's the halacha? You can't mate animals of different species. Midaraisa, you can go ahead and put them in the same pen. Rav Papa was saying, you can't even put it in the same pen because we know what's going to happen. But so how do we paskin? The Rama paskins in Hilchos Kilayim, Parak Tes Halacha Beis, Mutter lahachnis shnei minin l'sar echad. Rama paskins, you're allowed to put them in the same pen. Ve'im ra osan rovim zeh eno zakal afish. Not only that, this is interesting. Not only that, if you see the two different animals of two different species in the same pen having relations with each other, you don't have to break it up. You don't have to break it up, right? You don't have to go and separate them from each other. So I'll say quite interesting. So again, what do you see from here? That the biblical prohibition of kilayim is actively mating the animals together, putting them in the same pen, fine. And you see them now engaging in an active relationship, say, hey guys, break it up. You don't have to do that, right? That's not my obligation. That's whatever they're going to do, whatever they're going to do. My prohibition is to actively mate them together. Incredible. All right, so we'll say, so now along the same line, the Gemara says follows. What about the following case? According to Yidbi Papa Amar Rashi, Hamil Savamine Divei Rav Nechemia, Reish Galus, Mal Lahachlis Min B'Mino V'Sheina Mino L'Dir. So according to the Divei Rav Papa, that you can't go ahead and put two animals of different species together in the same pen. What if you did the following? What if you had a cow, an ox, and a donkey, right? So I will say, so now let's say, so what you have over here is you have two animals of the same species, right? And now a third animal in there. So is that permitted? So the Gemara says, so do we say that since ultimately, again, there's a min b'mino, there's two animals of the same species, they're going to be drawn to each other, and the donkey is going to be left out. Or maybe not. Maybe again, the Papa would say, even in this case, it should be asar. And we'll say, ultimately, again, we said it's asar. Why is it asar? So we'll say what we're concerned about over here is the following. We're concerned about, again, the general immorality of servants or slaves. What does that mean? Since slaves were generally known to be avadim kinanim, we're known to be immoral, we're concerned that the slave is dafka going to mate the two animals of the different species. And therefore, again, it's going to be asr. And I will say now, for our purposes, again, it's still mutter, because again, if you're allowed to go ahead and put the male and female from two different species together in the pen, right? So certainly, again, if it's min b'mino v'she'eno mino, right? Two animals of the same species, and then a third animal, certainly you can put them in the pen as well. Okay, Mishnah, here we go. But say haya oseh biyadav achol. Aval lo baraglov, baraglov aval lo biyadav, afilu b'kseif arizochas. We'll say, so now back to workers' entitlement for consumption. So we'll say, so the paradigmatic example of a worker is a worker who's working in the field with his entire body. What happens if you have a case of a worker who's working with his hands, but not with his feet? In other words, his work is stationary, or he's working with his feet, but not with his hands, or he just has to work with his shoulder but no other part of the body. In other words, that the work is not a full body experience. Rather, all the work requires is one part of his body. What's the halacha? The Tanna Kama says, ochal, you're allowed to eat. In other words, as long as you're actively engaged in work, you're allowed to eat while you work. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Omer, ach yaseh biyadav uberaglov. Rabbi Yosef says, no. The entitlement for a worker to eat while he works presupposes that he's working with his hands and his feet. In other words, that he's picking something, and moving along while picking as well. Okay, my timer. So we'll say, what's the logic over here? What's the logic of the Tanna Kama? Kisavo b'kamreyacha b'chol ma'ida avid. So we'll say the pasuk says when you come into the vineyard of your friend. So therefore the Tanna Kama says when you enter, as long as you're doing any kind of work with your hands, with your feet, with your shoulder, doesn't have to be everything. As long as you're doing some type of work, you're entitled to eat. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda Omer ad sheyaseh biyadav uberaglov. Rabbi Yosef Yehuda says until you actually work with your hands and with your feet. My time, Rabbi Yosef Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yosef Yehuda's logic? Listen to this. Kishar, because remember again, the entitlement of a worker to eat is compared to the entitlement of an ox to eat. So the Gemara says, Mashar ad sheyaseh biyadav uberaglov. Just like a shar, say when he works, is working with his hands and feet. Remember, when we hands and feet, the front legs of the shar are considered to be his hands. The hind legs are considered to be his feet. So when a shar works, he works with his hands and feet. So the Gemara says, therefore again, af poel ach yaseh biyadav uberaglov. So to a worker is only entitled to eat if he's working with his hands and feet. So the Gemara says, I bo Rabba bar Avhuna dash ba'avzin v'tarnagol Rabbi Yosef Yehuda mahu. This is so interesting. Let's say I'm threshing, I will say, with chickens or geese. Chickens or geese only have 2 feet. So I will say, so therefore again, are the chickens and geese entitled to eat while they thresh? Because after all, they're only using 2 feet. Mao. On one hand, Rabbi Yehuda is saying is, you only get to eat if you use your full strength. And for chicken and for goose, so 2 feet is their full strength. Therefore, they should get to eat. Or maybe on the other hand, no, you need to be able, you only get to eat if you use your hands and your feet. And they're not using their hands and their feet, they're only using 2 legs. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Teku. Okay, we'll have to see. Amram Nachman Rabbi Avua. Paulim ad shelo hilchu shesi v'arev begat ochlin anavim vein shosin yayin. Mishahilchu shesi v'arev begat ochlin v'anavim shosin yayin. So that's a really interesting halacha over here. which is as follows. I hired workers. I have a vat. I'm making wine. So we'll say, what's the job of the workers? To walk in the vat, to crush the grapes. This is interesting. So while the workers have only gone ahead and walked, let's say across the length of the vat, but not across the width, they're only entitled to eat grapes, not entitled to drink wine. Why? Because since they've only walked one direction, their effort has not yielded real results with the wine. Therefore, they're working with the grapes. They can eat from the grapes. Well, remember again, what's the halacha? You're only allowed to eat from what? The actual item that you're working with, but not another v'davar acher. So therefore, when they only walk in one direction, they haven't really pressed the grapes so much. Therefore, there's not really so much wine. Therefore, they're only entitled to eat the grapes. Once they've walked the length and the width of the wine press, then they're considered to be working with both the grapes and the wine, and are permitted or entitled to eat from both of those items. Right? We'll say, shkoyach. Stop over here for today. Great Gemara. Great Gemara. We're going to be continued tomorrow. Shkoyach. All right, Chevron Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Is it Wednesday already? Is it Wednesday already? Yeah. Okay.